So the last thing I'd like to make sure is that
The gentleman's
everybody
time
on
has
this committee should
expired.
watch Kill Tank.
The
I
gentleman's
hope
time
everybody
has
watch Kill Tank.
expired. The gentle lady from Missouri, Ms. Bush, is recognized. Ms. Bush?
St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. Although the audit in Arizona failed to uncover any evidence of widespread fraud, it was successful in achieving its bigger goal, to pave the way for election subversion laws that are spreading across this country. We have all talked a lot about voter suppression in recent months as the House has considered historic legislation, but the threat of election subversion has received far less attention. So I'd like to hear from our experts, and I know going over this again, just to be clear, just having a very clear understanding for me, what election subversion is and how this audit has fueled it and what Congress can do to address it. So Ms. Ramachandran, briefly, can you explain what election subversion is, just to be, so it can be a little more clear and how it differs from voter suppression, the difference?
Sure, and thank you for that question. I'm sure that different people would have slightly different definitions of all of these terms, but to me, election subversion is what occurs when someone tries to change the outcome of an election or manipulate the outcome of an election so that it does not reflect the true will of the voters. And of course, suppressing votes is one indirect way of doing that.
Thank you. How has the Cyber Ninjas partisan audit laid the groundwork for more election subversion laws? If you could answer that.
Thank you for that question. The Cyber Ninjas review has laid the groundwork for these laws because they've made insinuations of fraud, for instance, that we've seen repeated here today, actually. For instance, they implied that perhaps some voters had voted more than once in multiple counties. They implied that some voters who had moved from their residence and insinuated they were no longer eligible to vote had voted. They implied that, that the county was not keeping up its list maintenance properly, despite their membership in the ERIC database that the other witness mentioned. And through all of those implications, they justify future legislation that would propose undermining the will of the voters. So it fortunately did not pass, but there was a bill proposed in Arizona that would have permitted the state legislature to simply pick electors for president that were not the ones that the voters voted for. That kind of outrageous bill is the sort of thing these insinuations unfortunately lead to.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. The Brennan Center has found that in this year alone, more than 200 bills containing election subversion provisions have been introduced in state legislatures across the country, and 24 of those bills have been enacted into law. How are these laws then used to subvert the legitimate election results? I know you kind of touched on it, but we know that they're extremely dangerous. So can you go a little bit further into that?
Thank you so much for that question. I do have to apologize that it's a large effort to track all of these laws across the states, and I am certainly not the sort of primary lead on that effort at the Brennan Center, but I am familiar with my colleagues' work and the fact that there's a whole host of laws that make it harder to vote that have been popping up all over the country.
Yes, and as you brought up, 2 months into the Cyber Ninjas partisan audit in Arizona, HB 2720 was introduced by State Representative Shauna Bullock on May 24th, 2021. So Ms. Ramachandran, could you please explain what impact this particular bill would have on voters in Arizona, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous voters?
Thank you so much for that question. If that sort of legislation were ever to pass in Arizona, the impact would be severe because the voters would be at risk of having their choices not respected in the election for president. There would be a risk that the state legislature would attempt to choose a different slate of electors than the slate that received the most votes, merely because they did not like the outcome of the election. And obviously that would be, that means risking the disenfranchisement of millions of voters in Arizona if that were ever to come to fruition.
So this bill would allow the state legislature to override the popular vote in presidential elections up through Inauguration Day, which is a blatant display of white supremacy. It is profoundly dangerous for the survival of American democracy. If the people who run our elections do not believe in counting people's votes, it is clear that the threat of election subversion is present and grave. We must continue our oversight work to expose this audit and prevent anti-democratic election subversion laws from spreading any further. Thank you, and I yield back.